Okay, part 2 of chapter 5. To finish up the anatomy and physiology for this lesson. Next system we're going to look at is the cardiovascular system, which is the heart and the blood and the circulatory system, or the vessels. The heart being the pump, circulatory system being the transport routes, and then the blood being the transport agent. Blood is technically considered a connective tissue, but it does fall into the cardiovascular system. So in the cardiovascular system, we're talking a lot of vessels, arteries, veins, capillaries. Obviously the heart is the major component that we think of when we talk cardiovascular system, but it's only a component. They all play a very important part in how the whole system carries on. So here we have a picture of the heart, and the heart has two upper chambers, two lower chambers. Upper chambers referred to as atria, lower chambers referred to as ventricles. There's a right and left side. The left side deals with oxygenated blood. The right side deals with deoxygenated blood. So if we were to trace our route through the heart, we would have the blood come in from either the superior or inferior vena cava, which we can see is a big blue vessel coming from the north and south. They dump into the right atria, dump into the right atria. The blood is held there temporarily until the tricuspid valve opens up. That tricuspid valve is opened by the papilla muscles and the chordae tendineae. The blood then will dump down into the right ventricle, where it will be held, pumped by the nice strong muscular walls of the ventricle through the pulmonic or pulmonary valve, transported to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries, which is the really only exception to the rule that arteries generally carry oxygenated blood, and in this case they carry deoxygenated. The pulmonary system takes its turn doing what it does, oxygenating the blood and pulling the CO2 out, sends the blood back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. This is one of the few times in which veins don't carry deoxygenated blood. Actually, there's kind of an oddball situation called portal systems that kind of disobeys the rule. But so it brings the oxygenated blood back to the heart, dumps it into the left atria. Left atria holds it until the bicuspid valve. So if you have a hard time remembering try it before you buy it. The bicuspid valve, also called the mitral valve, will open up, dump the blood down into the left ventricle, which holds it temporarily until it can pump it then through the aortic valve into the aorta, which is the big red arch that goes across the top of the heart, and then takes a turn south and goes down to the body. The aorta is the largest and highest pressured artery in the body. So the conduction system of the heart, there has to be some electronic component, electrical stimulus then to feed the heart, tell the heart when to do its thing. The heart is special, and its cardiac muscle tissue is the only muscle tissue that really creates its own stimulus. There is a little influence from hormones and from the other parts of the nervous system, but for the most part, it's kind of self-supporting. The sinoatrial node, or SA node, where the arrows are all coming out, dispatches an electrical impulse. It spreads throughout the upper chambers of the heart. Some of that is reconvened at the atrioventricular, or AV node, held temporarily before they feed it down that stem to, which is called the bundle of His, into the two bundle branches, which they have marked as ventricular conduction system, and the little fibers that come off of that to help dispatch that electricity is then called the Purkinje fibers. Coronary arteries. The coronary arteries feed the heart itself, make sure the heart gets blood. The arteries work when blood is injected into the aorta from the left ventricle, but it takes the heart a split second for the heart to relax for just a moment. Blood will backflow against the aorta and against the aortic valve, and then will fill those coronary arteries. The left and right coronary arteries do come around and feed the back side of the heart. They don't completely touch, but pretty stinking close. And then for every coronary artery you generally have a mate coronary vein that goes along with it to bring the deoxygenated blood back. Blood is sent away from the heart in arteries. And in most cases, those arteries are high pressure. Actually, they're always high pressure. Very strong muscular walls that the blood is moved away from the heart. It branches off into smaller arteries called arterioles, who will then work their way into the capillary bed. The capillary bed is very, very small, tiny vessels, sometimes so small that red blood cells have to basically fold to get through. And the capillary bed is where the actual work gets done. The good stuff gets off and the bad stuff gets in, and away it goes. Channels it to the venules, and those venules are tiny veins that then merge together to form normal veins, and the veins will then transport that blood back in the direction of the heart. Veins do have valves in them to keep the blood from backflowing because they are low pressure. So in order to just kind of keep it marching in a straight line, they have these valves in place. Arteries are thick-walled, very muscular, high pressure. Veins, thin-walled, minimal muscles, and low pressure with valves. The composition of blood. Plasma is more than half of blood's volume. It is a thick, soupy substance, kind of like an uncooked egg white. The red blood cells are the erythrocytes. They're the transport agents. They transport the oxygen, the carbon dioxide occasionally, and some of the nutrients to the end organs or the cells that need them. We have the white blood cells, which are the leukocytes, and they are the ones that fight off infection and help with immunity. And platelets, those help with clotting. They have some sticky substance on the outside that helps them stick together, as well as some other chemicals, chemical messengers that they send to help get other substances involved. A pulse is a wave of blood flowing down an artery when that left ventricle contracts. So it can be felt where we have an artery pass over a firm structure and near the skin, and that's where we can go and check pulses at. There's a couple of different types of pulses: radial, brachial, posterior tibial, dorsalis, pedis, and then we have a couple central pulses such as the carotid and femoral. Peripheral is on the limbs, and central is right towards the core, or the trunk of the body. There's one more type of pulse that's not listed on here. It's called the apical pulse, and that's when you take a stethoscope and you listen directly to their heart. It doesn't always give you an adequate picture of how well they're circulating because you don't feel the actual physical process, you just hear part of it. So central pulses are where we're going to go if we have an unconscious patient. The patient's unconscious, we go reaching for the carotid artery most of the time because it's the easiest one to find, and it's the largest artery that we can palpate easily. So we also have the femoral pulse, which is found in the groin, not always easy to find, and not generally socially acceptable when we just walk up to somebody to check their femoral pulse. So the carotid pulse, again, the big pulse we're going to go for if we have an unresponsive patient, because if they're pulseless, we need to get moving. This picture shows an example of checking a carotid pulse. You put your fingers on your Adam's apple, slide them down into the little groove about a ½ inch from the midline there, either way. And in that depression there, the little groove, is where you should be able to find the carotid pulse. It's not on the outside of that. It's not on the side of your neck. It's on the front of your neck. So generally fairly easy to find. Never check them both at the same time on a patient. On the right and the left side, you'll cut off blood flow to their brain. But for the most part, pretty quick and easy to find. Brachial pulse, this is our #1 pulse for infants and small children. It's fairly easy to find in them because they don't have the muscle mass, whereas most adults have more muscle mass, and it's going to be a little bit more difficult to find. You'll find it in the groove between the bicep, or the big bulging muscle on the top of the arm, and the tricep, or the kind of somewhat bulging muscle on the bottom side of the arm. In an adult, if you would like to find that, it's usually easier to find it closer down, just follow that groove down closer to the elbow, and that's where you usually will be able to find that in the adult patient. Radial pulse, this is our probably most commonly used pulse because most of our patients aren't unconscious. Radial pulse is on the thumb side of the wrist, right about where you would wear a wristwatch or a bracelet, and it is, if you would point your fingers straight out, draw a line straight down your index finger towards your elbow, and right about where it comes in contact with that wristwatch area is right about where you should be able to find that radial pulse. It is not on the top side of the wrist or the thumb surface. It's on the palm surface, that really soft portion of the forearm down there. There is one pulse on the other side called the ulnar pulse. It's generally not as strong of a pulse and it's not as big of an artery. You would find that by simply tracing, same trick, pointing the fingers out straight and trace a straight line down from your pinky finger towards your elbow, and you will come in contact with the area of the wrist that you generally would find the ulnar pulse. Femoral pulse, like I mentioned, it is in the groin, where the groin meets the leg in that crease. If you wear, let's say if you wear briefs for undergarments, it's right there where your leg comes out of the brief, and it's on the inner aspect of that area. You take your thumb and put it on the crest of your hip bone in the front there, reach your fingers down as far as you can, right into that crease. You generally are going to be right in the same area that you need to be looking for the femoral pulse at. So it's just off to the either side of the genitals. So, Dorsalis pedis, this is found on the ridge of the foot. Basically take and draw, if you would put your finger between your big toe and the toe right next to it, and draw a straight line up the foot towards the ankle, staying just on the outside of that big ridge that the big toe is. You would find the dorsal pedis right there. Once you find that, it's a good idea to take your ink pen or your Sharpie and just put a little mark there so you can real quickly find it again. It's not as big of a pulse as a radial or a carotid or femoral, so it can be a little more difficult to find. If you were going to look for the posterior tibial pulse, remember your tibia is your shin bone, and if you take a moment and remember that the only place you can find your fibula is on the outer ankle, you can remember, well, the inner ankle then has to be the tibia, so you go right behind the ankle bone into the little soft spot on the inside of the ankle, and that's where you will find your posterior tibial pulse. So behind the ankle, inside, soft spot. Blood pressure. If we're looking for a blood pressure, the blood pressure is the pressure inside the arteries. The systolic blood pressure is the upper reading. It's the pressure of the artery pressing against the pressure of the blood flow from the ventricle pushing against the artery walls. And then the diastolic would be the pressure that remains in the arteries after the heart has contracted or it's in a resting or refilling state. The heart phase of pumping is called systole. The heart phase of relaxing or resting is called diastole, hence the name systolic and diastolic. If you have a hard time remembering which is which, remember that diastolic and down both start with a D, and that might help you keep those two straight. The classic textbook number of a normal blood pressure is 120/80. Remember, that is simply an average. There are plenty of people who are lower than that, and a significant number that are way higher than that. Perfusion. Perfusion is the adequate circulation of blood and exchange of oxygen and waste products. So just having the blood circulate around all by itself isn't necessarily everything that the body needs. It needs to be able to respirate, and respiration is the ability to exchange the products. So we have to be able to dump off the good stuff and pick up the bad stuff and take it away. If we can't do that, we're in a hypoperfusion state, also known as shock. So when you're in shock, you have an inadequate flow, and therefore all the processes don't work as well as they should. So how does the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system or circulatory system work together? Without one, the other doesn't work. So you have to have the good products being brought in and the bad products being taken out, which is the respiratory system's job, and then you have to have the transport from one spot to another, and that's the circulatory system's job. So if you don't have those, you shift from having a nice, efficient system of creating energy through the use of oxygen and glucose. This is called aerobic metabolism. It creates something called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is our energy source. It's about 16 times more efficient than doing it anaerobically, which is when there's not significant amounts of acid present. We create pyruvic acid, or not significant amounts of oxygen. Doesn't make very much energy, but it creates pyruvic acid, and pyruvic acid turns into lactic acid, which we know can create some problems. So if we have a mismatch in the ventilatory capacity and the circulatory capacity, things go downhill very quickly. So moving to the nervous system, central nervous system contains the brain and the spinal cord, and then there's also the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is marked in red, the peripheral nervous system marked in blue. The brain and the spinal cord are really kind of in charge of everything, and the peripheral nervous system is really kind of the working agents. So we have the brain, which really controls almost everything, and it conducts a lot of its messages via the spinal cord. And then the spinal cord will relay a lot of these on then to the peripheral nervous system. So that peripheral nervous system has sensory and motor components to it, and that's only one aspect of it. Sensory nerves obviously tell us hot, cold, sharp, dull, so on and so forth, whereas motor nerves tell us move this, move that. So to get up and walk across the room, you're using the motor. When you're using your sense of taste, that's a sensory nervous system that's getting used. It's also a part of the nervous system that's not identified here, but we have the autonomic nervous system, and that autonomic should also be thought of as automatic. That autonomic nervous system maintains our kind of state of awareness and activity. We can have something that really stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight. So when that pager goes off, you get that adrenaline rush to go on an ambulance call. That's a lot of sympathetic nervous system. Or the opposite of it is rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. That's rest and digest, or feed and breed. These are the systems that really are the kind of vegetative function of the body, and so they're always in balance. One's a little more leading the way a little more than the other. Obviously, when we're sleeping, we're very heavy in the parasympathetic side of things, and the sympathetic system is nearly almost completely shut off. To move to the digestive system, everything that's pictured here is not necessarily digestive organ, but a lot of it has some kind of participation in the whole process. Some of it actually has none, though. So digestion starts at the mouth with the teeth physically grinding food, and then we have the saliva and the salivary amylase, which starts to break down starches and carbohydrates. We swallow that food down. It comes down the esophagus. You can just see the bit of the esophagus there right next to the midline shown here on the picture. Esophagus dumps the food into the stomach, and the stomach starts the significant amount of breaking down the food processes. There's a lot of stomach acid in there. Remember, the stomach lining is simply protected by a layer of mucus. Other than that, the stomach acid could dissolve it. That stomach acid is strong enough to dissolve metal, so it's pretty amazing. People who have ulcers generally have lost some of their mucus, and that's why the acid starts to eat away the stomach. Food gets spends an hour or two in the stomach being worked on by the different chemicals, acids, and so on and so forth, it's pushed out of the stomach into the small intestine. It's small in its diameter, or in how big around it is. However, it's longer than the large intestine. So when we say small and large, we're talking about the width, not the length. So the small intestine has several components to it. It migrates it around, and it's all that pink stuff that's kind of in the middle of the picture here. And it moves it all around. It's somewhere around 30 feet long or so before it ends up over by the appendix, which is marked over there in the right lower quadrant, and that's where it merges with the large intestine. The appendix is really not used by the human body anymore. It's a vestigial organ. It has a little bit of lymphatic tissue to it, but that's about it. Most of the time it just is there to create problems for us. And then the large intestine, are also referred to as the colon, will take the food from the small intestine and it'll move it up and over and down and towards the middle through its various sections. The small intestine, most of the content of the small intestine is very liquid, and the content of the large intestine is becoming ever more solid. So we have almost a slush in the small intestines, and it starts to form into basically pellets or so in the larger intestine and become a little bit more formed. The large intestine will then transport it over to the rectum, which is the holding tank for feces, before we decide to expel that via the anus. Now, along the way, a couple other organs kind of participate here. The liver and the gallbladder, they participate in some fat breakdown. The liver has a lot to do with processing the foods, processing the nutrients that we get from the foods. There's a lot of blood vessels that pass directly from the intestines to the liver to allow the processing to occur. The gallbladder really has mostly to do with fat. It creates and stores bile, and the bile is injected into the food as it comes out of the stomach, so it can start to break down some of those fats. The pancreas, which also sits in there kind of up and under the stomach, is responsible for secreting a couple of hormones, insulin being the main one and glucagon being the other one. There's a couple others that it does as well, but they're really responsible for making sugar available and usable. The remainder of the items in the abdominal content, the kidneys don't directly deal with digestion. They deal with waste product after the fact. So when the body cells have created some sort of a waste, is transported via the blood to the kidneys, where it's filtered and then dumped out. The kidneys will filter the substances and then drop it into kind of a little funnel, where it will funnel down into the ureters. The ureters will take it to the urinary bladder, where it is stored until time to be expelled via the urethra. The spleen sits back there behind the stomach on the left upper quadrant. The spleen is a blood bank and lymphatic tissue. You can live without a spleen, that's okay. But if it gets hit or damaged, it tends to bleed a lot. So the integumentary system. The integumentary system is our skin. It is our largest organ of our body. It covers our body. The largest internal organ is the liver in the digestive system. But the integumentary system has a couple of very important things. It protects us, it controls our water, it's our temperature regulating system. We can excrete a little bit of stuff through our skin, mainly through either the sebaceous glands or the sweat glands. And then, of course, it is a protective armor, or a shock absorber, really. There are three major layers to the skin: the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue. The epidermis is composed of dead cells that get rubbed off or sloughed off and replaced, has no blood vessels or nerves, and is really more just kind of a hard candy shell on our body that we refer to as an M&M. Or our M&M we refer to as our body, I should say. The dermis is rich with blood vessels, nerves, and other specialized structures, such as the sweat glands and the sebaceous glands. Sebaceous is oils, and sweat glands is obviously sweat. The sebaceous glands generally empty onto the hair follicle to help kind of lubricate that and allow the hair to continue to grow easily, as well as it does some conditioning of our skin. And then obviously the hair follicle resides within the dermal layer as well. There are some minor blood vessels in there. There are some nerve endings in there that help us detect various sensations in the outside world. And then under that is our subcutaneous layer. Subcutaneous layer is generally fat. It's fatty tissue. It's really kind of a bright yellow highlighter color. And within that there's also larger blood vessels, some nerves, and some other minor structures. And below the subcutaneous layer we have the fascia, which is the casing around the muscles. And then of course the muscles, bones, etc. Endocrine system. The endocrine system is the body's hormones. There's a variety of places these come from. There's the three sections of the brain, pituitary, hypothalamus, and pineal gland, which have a lot of really major oversight and control. The thyroid and the parathyroids. Thyroid deals a lot with your metabolism. Parathyroid deals with your calcium. The adrenal glands on top of your kidneys, they secrete the epinephrine, norepinephrine that's used in the sympathetic nervous system. They also secrete some natural steroids within our body. Pancreas, it secretes a couple of different hormones used in maintaining sugar control, as well as some things, some other oddball sort of things get secreted there as well. We have the gonads, which are the testes in the male or the ovaries in the female, and they secrete testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. Obviously, the balance is not the same in men and women. There's more progesterone and estrogen in females and very little testosterone, and vice versa in the male. And then we've got the little guy called the thymus gland. Thymus gland is the only organ that really basically shrinks as you grow. It's very active in building immunity as a child, but as an adult, it doesn't get used a whole heck of a lot. So it actually almost shrinks up a bit. Renal system. This helps to regulate fluid levels, chemicals, pH, and really it is composed of the kidneys, the urinary bladder, the ureters, and the urethra. The kidneys will interact with the blood, pulls the extra waters and chemicals out of the blood, and funnels them down through a nice convoluted system until it dumps into the middle of the kidney. It's taken by the ureters from the kidney to the urinary bladder and stored until we decide to get rid of it via our urethra. But within the kidney, it's a very complicated system where there's a lot of different chemicals playing in here, trying to help determine what's the right sodium and potassium balance, what's the right water balance, what do we need to keep, what do we need to get rid of, maybe we should pull some back, maybe we should put some back. So it's very complicated. But the urinary bladder, urethra, and ureters are really more of conduit and storage. The big functional capacity here is in the kidneys. All right, male reproductive system, as evidenced from this poor guy who got cut in half. Really, the major portion of the male reproductive system is actually external, and that's the scrotum and its contents being the testes and the epididymis. There's a tube then that connects it in with other parts to the system. The prostate gland, which is in males, right around the urethra at the base of the urinary bladder, has some minor sex characteristics to it, but it also joins up with the ejaculatory duct, which holds some of the content of semen, and in conjunction with the ductus deferens or the vas deferens, they will join up with the content of the testes and the epididymis, and will ejaculate it then out of the urethra. Urethra is shared by both the urinary system and the reproductive system in the male. They share the same route. And then obviously the penis having a lot of spongy tissue in it that fills with blood to make it erect to make copulation or coitus possible. Female reproductive system, on the other hand, is almost exclusively internal. The female reproductive system, you have the outer opening being the vaginal introit and the labia, but the vagina itself is the path up to the internal organ. The internal organs of reproduction are the ovary, the uterine tube or fallopian tubes that leads from each ovary to the uterus, and then we have the uterus. The uterus is where implantation would occur, and the baby would grow if that were the case, that a woman would be pregnant. Every 28 days, the ovaries will roughly eject 1, sometimes 2 mature eggs. Those eggs will work their way usually through the uterine tube with the intent of being fertilized. And once they're fertilized, hopefully they would implant then in the uterus. But if there is no implantation of a fertilized egg in the uterus, within about 14 days after the egg was expelled, then the woman will shed the lining of her uterus, which was getting ready for implantation, and that's when she has her menstrual period. A couple interesting facts here. The uterus, fallopian tubes, and ovaries are very small when they're not being put to use during pregnancy. The whole structure would fit in the palm of your hand. It's just it's pretty amazing knowing that you can then eventually stick a baby inside that uterus and it will grow to accommodate and become quite large towards the end of pregnancy. The other interesting thing is a woman is born with all the eggs she will ever have. It just takes them a while to mature throughout her fertile years, and after she has reached basically the capacity of her fertile years, she will then have her menopause. So in review, there's obviously a variety of things to cover in this chapter: medical terminology, the different terms that we use to discuss the patient's positioning, the large number of body systems that we're dealing with, and the associated structures that go along with them. Communication is big for this chapter. Getting a lot of the information from this chapter helps us sound like medical professionals and helps us talk the same language. So there's a lot to learn here. There's a lot of information here, so I suggest that you spend a lot of time in your textbook, as well as if you've got the opportunity to sit down and do some of that supplemental medical terminology work that's posted in your course page. It'll help you out immensely. A couple questions to consider. Is my use of the medical terms accurate and descriptive? Again, if you don't know what it means, don't use it. If you think you know what it means, look it up and make sure that you know what it means. And can I identify critical organs and structures that reside in the area where the patient maybe has a complaint or a traumatic injury? By going, okay, I kind of know that maybe the liver, the gallbladder, and some of the small and large intestine is there, so that kind of gives me an idea of where I'm going. So you respond to a teenage boy who has taken a hard fall from his dirt bike. He's a deep gash on the outside of his left arm, halfway between his shoulder and his elbow, and another on the inside of his right arm, just above his wrist. His left leg is bent at a funny angle about halfway between the hip and knee. When you cut away his pants, you see that a bone is sticking out of the wound on the front side. How will you describe these patients' injuries over the radio to the hospital staff? So that's a good little exercise for you guys to work on, is how exactly are you going to describe these wounds.